Greetings and salutations. This is Derek with Taylor Whips. Recently, Tori Fisher of SwordguyBuilds.com published a video on the basic motion of a whip and the general principles behind what makes a whip crack and how to do it. He is a phenomenal whip maker and a phenomenal whip cracker. Very few people have a command of the whip and its energy like Tori does. I have a slightly different take on what makes a whip crack, and I use slightly different terminology that perhaps might clarify some of the things that Tori was talking about. Let me explain. It is my understanding that, generally speaking, all that's required to make a whip crack is torquing the handle 180 degrees from its starting point and letting the whip move a wave of energy through it with sufficient speed and getting to a specific shape in order for it to crack. As Tori explains it, the whip needs to have tension in it in order to crack, and he uses the guitar string metaphor to explain that. I don't fully agree with that metaphor because a guitar string has tension at both ends, and the wave of energy is passed continuously back and forth from one end to the other end as it vibrates. A whip is only ever can have tension at one end, and so therefore that metaphor doesn't quite hold, especially as it refers to in physics, the one end being fixed and the other end being able to move in an infinite number of directions. What I do think is going on is not necessarily tension, but torque. The whip, in order to move, has to have the handle or the grip torqued in a direction to provide the energy to form a loop and get the whip to crack. Torque happens around a pivot point or along an axis. It rotates along that axis in order to crack. And so in order to get a whip to crack, it doesn't need to necessarily be under tension. It does need to be perhaps stretched out, but the motion of the whip comes from torque, not tension. In this example, I can start from a stationary position where the whip is absolutely motionless, and I can torque it around the handle and get it to move and crack without needing it to be under tension to begin with. Tension may help, or having the whip stretched out and elevated above the surface of the ground may help, but it's not the tension that gives it the energy. It is the motion and the torque as applied through the handle that gets it to move. Second, Tori does point out that the whip needs directional energy in order to make the whip crack. He provides the example of giving it forward momentum. The whip, in the end, needs to come, to my understanding, to a specific position with a specific speed. There's a threshold where it needs to cross and get to a specific shape with a specific speed in order to get the whip to crack. If it's moving too slowly, the whip will not crack. If the whip is moving with sufficient speed but does not make the shape, it will not crack. In this instance, I'm going to start with the loop already in the whip, and I'm going to push it down the length of the whip. It does come close to making the proper shape, but because it does not have the right amount of speed, it doesn't crack. It may get close, but it does not crack because it does not have the right speed. Simultaneously, I can swing the whip in a circle and really move it quickly, and that, under normal circumstances, normal whip cracking would be far more than enough to get the whip to crack. But because it does not achieve the proper shape, the tip of the whip does not create any sort of looping or hairpin shape, the whip cannot crack. In order for the whip to crack, it needs to achieve a shape with speed. If it doesn't have the right shape, the whip will not crack. If it doesn't have sufficient speed, the whip will not crack. The rule of thumb is if the whip is stretched out and swung, keeping it all the way up off the ground, it has enough momentum to get it to crack more or less on its own. That is because it has sufficient speed and momentum to carry it above that threshold, so long as it achieves the proper shape. Now, the whip does not need to be stretched out in the air in order for it to crack. It just needs to be torqued 180 degrees from one side of a plane to the other side of the plane. It is theoretically possible to lay the whip on the ground and, moving only the handle, roll it straight over and have the whip crack. Here I have the whip laid out straight in the grass to show that it is not necessary to get the whip all the way up off the ground in order to make it crack. All that needs to happen is the handle needs to be torqued 180 degrees from its starting position. The handle is going to go from here, remaining with the heel on the ground, and it will move up and over. Moving the whip handle as I specified. Did you hear that? That was simply torque of the handle 180 degrees. The whip handle stops when it hits the ground. I can't provide any additional energy after that. Here I'll move it, instead of exactly vertical and over, I'll move it a little diagonal. You hearing that? This never leaves the ground. The whip does need energy input, and that energy input has to be directional, but it does not necessarily mean forward or backwards momentum, because the whip's momentum and direction of travel is only impacted as it relates to the position of the body. Where I disagree with Tori is what the whip cracker must do with his hands after the loop has been, or after the whip has been given a loop and has been put into forward momentum. Tori talks about pulling the arm in and dragging down and back to provide, as he describes, continuous tension to get the whip to crack. He says, get the whip out of its own way. I disagree with that. I can point the whip straight at the camera and leave my arm exactly where it starts once I send the loop, send the energy forward, and not have to move my arm in or down in any way. Let me demonstrate. I'll do this with a cattleman's crack. Swing up, pushing forward, and I did not have to move my hand at all after I sent the loop forward. You can move your hand in and down to get the main body of the whip out of the direction of travel, but it's an unnecessary motion. I think it's unnecessary and perhaps detrimental for several reasons. The first, a whip will send a wave of energy in one direction very well. If it has only one energy input, it will execute that energy input exactly as stated, exactly as I tell the whip to do. When I start introducing different waves of energy through the whip will do all of those things at once, meaning that the waves of energy will have additive and destructive sums overall. For example, if I push the whip forward and bring my hand in, the whip, instead of rolling straight and true and moving the body of the whip out, I will change the angle at which the thong of the whip moves through the air. Here's an example: straightforward throw. Now I'll throw the whip and move my hand in at the same time. The wave of the whip, instead of traveling along a specific plane, it goes and changes to a different plane. Notice how instead of traveling straight and true, it goes between planes and cuts across in a sort of diagonal. Your arm and the handle have to move in a single direction in order for the whip to go in a single direction. The more that it moves, the more that the whip will interpret that energy and go somewhere between the two. It is not essential for you to move your hand inwards in the slightest. It changes the direction of travel of the whip, makes it far more difficult to control and predict and place in any specific point, and it's an unnecessary use of energy. So long as the energy travels in a single direction, it will go in a single direction. Once I add additional forces, the whip will take those combined energies and it will have additive and destructive results. Additionally, it is not necessary to drop the hand and elbow and pull back in order to get the whip to crack cleanly. The whip will move on its own exactly where it wants to go. Can it sometimes wrap on itself? Yes, but only if the energy input is incorrect. If the energy input is clean, the whip will move cleanly and will not tangle on itself like it just did. That was my fault, not the whip's fault. I don't need to move the whip differently. I need to move differently. That was moving differently. With all that, any missed cracks happen because I haven't provided it either enough speed or with the proper shape. As far as dropping the hand and elbow and pulling back goes, I believe that to be an unnecessary and, again, detrimental or potentially detrimental motion because, like with pulling the hand in, you're introducing a different energy wave into the whip. Instead of having the whip run straight along one line, if you pull down and back, it's now torquing around a different axis, which will make the whip, instead of following a single direction path, move in multiple ways. Instead of going straight along a path, if I drop my hand, I will shorten the distance in which I am away from the tip of the whip, so the crack is going to sound louder to me. It also brings it closer to me, which is potentially dangerous, and instead of sending the crack to a specific location, it moves where the crack happens. If I throw the whip out, the crack happens at the level of my head or above. If I drop my elbow, the crack happened right here. And so it sends the crack up and towards myself. It's not a necessary motion to drop the hand. It sometimes helps to get the crack to sound louder, but that is due to two things: the closer proximity to my own ears and the introduction of more energy, which may help in speeding the tip of the whip up as it achieves the cracking shape. When I throw the whip and leave my hand exactly where it started, I'm not applying any additional force nor giving it any additional tension. If the whip needs it, gravity will take care of it. Gravity will pull the main body of the whip down, so I don't have to. Since it's already doing it, dropping my hand only brings the crack closer to me, the whip cracker. The whip will crack just fine if you move it along a particular plane and let it finish cracking before you, as the whip user, move. I believe that most whip crackers who drop their elbow when they crack their whips do so because they do not have proper maintenance or proper conservation of the energy through the whip. They don't know how to get energy another way. And so they rely on the muscles of their arm to pull the whip through instead of relying on the structure of the whip to just do its thing. Dropping one's hand and elbow also tends to make the whip cracker more reliant on arm strength than structure. And as such, most beginning whip crackers will tire themselves out cracking whips because they rely on pulling the whip through the crack instead of achieving the proper shape with the whip. If noise is what I'm after, sure, moving my hand and arm will help to get the noise because I'm providing additional energy, additional speed into the tip of the whip that will help it to cross the threshold of the crack. However, I stay away from that because if I rely on it too much, I will become overly reliant on it. If all I have to rely on is my own strength and not my structure, when my strength fails, my whip cracking fails. If I move too fast and become overly reliant on pulling the whip through, especially with a long whip, I will have no place to go with my body, and the whip will not crack because I have already exhausted every option to get it to crack. Likewise, pulling the whip through might make the whip move too fast for things. It will provide additional speed, and instead of having one crack happen, moving into another crack, I will very likely not be able to keep up with how fast I've told the whip to go. If I throw the whip and move, I can always move faster, but there is a point where I, the human being, cannot keep up with the energy traveling through the whip. The whip can always move faster than me. In my own opinion, it is far better to move slowly than it is to move quickly, because I can always speed up. But if it is already going too fast, it is very difficult to get it to slow down again to be manageable. A whip is a very simple tool. It does one thing very well, and multiple things not very well. In order for the whip to crack, and to crack well, it has to be guided along a path as close to one wave of energy as possible. The more energy that's put into a whip that does not follow the initial wave of energy will make it more difficult to be precise in its cracking, and in fact more difficult to crack well. I very much appreciate Tori and his perspective. Like I said, he is a phenomenal whip maker and a phenomenal whip cracker. Very few people have the ability to move the whip like he does. I view things a little bit differently than he does, and I'm grateful for his perspective. Hopefully this gives some additional insight into what whip cracking can do and helps to simplify the ideas around how to do it well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on my next adventure.